and get back to business. That's the message of A Nation at Risk, 1983. And so these ideas were pushed aside. They had begun to infiltrate public education. There were open classrooms, there were public schools of choice, there was a lot of excitement about what could happen in public schools, and it got slammed shut. The culture did not want it. It was a countercultural way of thinking, and the mainstream culture pushed it aside. And so what you see in schools even today is still that wave of reaction against the 60s and early 70s, and they've been very effective at it. However, thousands of people have said, all right, that's what you're going to do in public schools, we're out of here. And you have this whole revived movement of alternatives across the country and in many parts of the world. So schools like Wellspring, or the dramatic rise of Montessori and Waldorf schools, the spread of democratic schools and homeschooling. It really is a social movement that's emerging in many ways in many parts of the country. What I find, and what I have found over all these years, is people discover one approach or another that they feel comfortable with, and they go with it. So I'm a Montessorian, or I'm a follower of Rudolf Steiner, or whatever it is. I'm a homeschooler. And so we don't have a unified movement. We just have this grassroots assortment of initiatives happening in many different ways. And for a long time, that bothered me, because I thought, how are we going to overthrow the system if we're so diffuse, if we're so scattered, if there's no recognizable movement here? It's easy to say, oh yeah, you Waldorf people, yeah, all 5,000 of you, big deal. And that's what can happen. Why don't we get together and have an educational rights movement, all of us together? And for a long time, I felt that there's a philosophical approach that can do that can knit us all together, and it's called holistic education. It doesn't mean you have to change what you're doing. You can still be teaching, working with kids the way that you already are, but you're part of something bigger. You're part of a holistic education movement. And I really thought for a few years that this was the answer. This was going to build a movement. And very recently, I guess the last 3 or 4 years, I've finally accepted that most people don't see it the way I do. And I think there is something valuable in a holistic philosophy, and I'll talk about that next. But I'm much more comfortable now saying this is a grassroots movement that's just going to emerge very organically. There's no leader. There's no prophet bringing it down. There's no Martin Luther King in this movement. And what I started calling it was a self-organizing revolution. It's my latest book. So the term self-organization comes out of holistic scientific thinking, holistic biology, where I have to talk about holism now. Holism talks about everything in existence, everything in the universe being interconnected, and not connected on like a flat plane, but there are layers of reality, layers of meaning. So something is always in the context of something bigger, which is in the context of something else bigger, on and on and on into infinity. And so any given phenomenon, whether you want to talk about the human body, or you want to talk about a child in school, or you want to talk about the economic system, anything you look at in the world is whole in itself. It's a meaningful whole, and it's comprised of smaller parts that are wholes in themselves, and it's part of something bigger. It's nested. You think of those Russian dolls where there's one, what are they called, the Petrushka, or Katrushka? Marushka? Babushka, whatever.
Matryoshka.
But that's what it's like. There's one inside another to infinity. And so when you start thinking like this, it changes everything. Because no longer do you say, oh, I found the answer. The answer is, pick it, socialism, anarchism, Montessori, Freud. I mean, there's no one answer. What you have found is a part. It's whole. It makes sense in its own context, but there's also this. So for every capitalist, you could say, oh, but here's a socialist idea. And for every socialist, you could say, oh, but here's free enterprise. And there's always another point of view that is looking at a complementary aspect. No one's ideology can contain the whole. So holism is a very generous and open-ended way of thinking that says, all right, I see why this educational approach is more structured. The Waldorf educator is really in charge of the classroom, and the teacher says, all right, we're going to do this now, and all the kids do it. And at the other extreme, you have a free school, a democratic school, or an unschooling parent, and says, okay, children, what do you want to do? I'm here if you need me. Neither of those is fully correct. Neither of them is fully incorrect. It's aspects of a greater whole. We need both structure and freedom as human beings, depending on the circumstances, depending on the context. And so a holistic educator, in my view, is someone you can't possibly be trained in all of these methods and be applying them all the time. That's just not humanly possible. But you can be open enough to be present at any moment in your teaching, and you say, all right, my classroom is generally pretty loose and open, but right now I've got this kid who needs to be held, who needs to be whatever, needs to be guided, needs something more than what we usually do here. And you do that. And it's not a contradiction of your educational philosophy. It's a recognition that no one way of thinking captures every reality. What more can I say about holism? So holism itself is not an ideology, is not a religion. It's a practice of being as constantly open and responsive from deep within yourself as you can be. It's like a lifelong practice of cultivating presence. And some of the really great holistic educators, I think of Rachel Kessler, who just died a couple months ago, that was her main focus, was the teaching presence. How do you cultivate yourself to be fully involved with the people who you're with? That if you can do that, and that's what Krishnamurti is all about too. Right? So if you can do that, it almost doesn't matter what your methods are. Your presence is going to create an authentic learning experience for the people in your classroom. Another aspect of this, let me just take a sip. There's often a conflict between individualism and social responsibility. And we see this even in the educational alternatives movement. Even back in the free school movement in the 60s, there were those who put a lot of emphasis on self-expression. The children should be free. No one should be laying their trip on them. Remember that phrase from the 60s, right? The adults shouldn't be constraining kids. So people like A.S. Neal and Summerhill and John Holt sort of went in that direction. But then you had others who said, well, wait a minute. We live in a social context that's very unequal, that's very unjust. And if all you're talking about is personal freedom, then how do we change society? How do we address poverty and racism? You're shirking responsibility for these very difficult problems that affect a lot of people. So you have Jonathan Kozol writing a book called Free Schools, where he says having a free school, how did he put it, for the happy kids of upper middle class whites is like having a sandbox for the children of the SS guards at Auschwitz. You know, really, I think he overdid the rhetoric there, but he's making the point that if you're totally oblivious to social responsibility and to your place in the political and socioeconomic system, then just talking about freedom is going to lead you astray. It's going to lead you to a narcissistic, right-wing, libertarian, whatever you want to call it, attitude where you just don't care about people who are suffering. As long as your kids are doing well and happy, hey, let them start a free school. But they can't because the system is stacked against them. So a holistic point of view doesn't take sides here. when you think holistically,